Hi, I want to make another pointless video, and the pointless video this time is kind of, because there's nothing else much to talk about that I haven't covered that's important. So I'm going to talk about thinking. Just because you can think it doesn't mean it's possible. Just because a notion in your head passes doesn't mean it's going to pass in reality outside the notion, beyond the fact that you think something. Just because you think time travel exists, you can think about it. You can think about all the things all the notions, but obviously there's something that contradicts the notion of the lack of something that allows that kind of thing to happen in reality. And obviously there's things like paradoxes and things like that where time travel, but also time travel is a contrivance, just like the contrivance of things like paradoxes and things contradicting each other, and this not things happening, two contradictory things happening, two things that shouldn't happen at the same time happening at the same time, and contriving these things where you think something's possible. It thinks the notion in your head exists. It exists as some kind of a concept or an idea like infinite, but obviously beyond that, you're contriving things or things beyond that to make it seem you're only building yourself a deeper. You're only digging a deeper grave when you decide to keep going with the description of these things, or go into deeper detail about these contrivances, or these unrealistic ideas that you think about. You can think of all sorts of things. Obviously, scientifically speaking, you can think about a unicorn. We can scientifically create reindeers or unicorns tomorrow, right? We can scientifically create an invisible man behind us that we can't prove or exist. All these concepts are all possible. Concepts that we describe as not being able to be described, we can describe them and create them ourselves. We can create a guy behind us that we can't describe or see or anything like that, that isn't there but is there at the same time. It's a contrivance. Just because you can come up with contrivances and contradictory ideas doesn't mean it can exist beyond the notion in your head that you have. And the notion in your head that you have is all that you do have, and it exists. I mean, the notion in your head is an interaction that's existing, and you can create these ideas in your head, but obviously these contrivances that we create, even though they don't exist in and of themselves, I mean, they're contrived, but they're contrived based on an idea that we find to be possible. Or we're contriving something off that isn't possible. That is possible. We're contriving off contradictions or paradoxes or conundrums or anything like that, those problems that we can't solve, two contradictory ideas going on at the same time, white but not white, or white but black at the same time. Instead of trying to find something, go into the details and seeing if there's not just some kind of misinterpretation of the details. It's describing, okay, this circle is white, but it's also black at the same time. Well, from our understanding, we know what white is, we know what black is, and it's sort of like making that contrivance and describing a situation like that. Beyond that, the situation can't be described beyond a notion in your head, and a notion in your head, even though something does exist, doesn't mean that you can't contrive some kind of contradiction in and of itself to describe a situation and make it seem like it's some kind of contrivance. Just because you think it's possible doesn't mean it is possible. And just because it is possible doesn't mean that you can't come up with some kind of contrivance to make it seem like the contrivance is possible, because the thing that you're basing the contrivance off of, the paradox or the conundrum, is true. Just because you can think of a watermelon doesn't mean that a watermelon can exist but not exist at the same time, or the watermelon can be one but two at the same time. Or you can contriving all sorts of paradoxes or things like that, or surrounding realistic things, or contriving paradoxes based on something that doesn't exist, almost digging yourself into a deeper hole, or a double negative in describing situations like that. You're describing something that doesn't exist and contriving some kind of paradox and describing the existence based on something that doesn't exist to begin with, like time travel, something that doesn't exist or isn't possible, and contriving something out of it. Just because you can think of it and the notions in your head, and you can think about the paradoxes, almost in a way proves that it doesn't exist. You're contriving something, and paradoxes mean something when the thing that you're contriving doesn't exist. Sort of like time travel, you're just going to come up with paradoxes, and paradoxes and conundrums and things like that come from those ideas that don't exist, or contriving something in and of itself that does exist, or you think about and applying to contriving a paradox or a conundrum or something like that, and making it, contriving that and making it come into reality. And that's all you're doing, is you're making things up, and there's nothing more than that, than making things up or contriving some kind of crap to make sure you can describe a situation, to make it seem like there's something more beyond the understanding than it actually is. And that's where a lot of this beyond our understanding and comprehension comes from, is contriving paradoxes and conundrums like time travel, like understanding some kind of contrivance in time travel, based on a paradox or something, and understanding it and looking past it and figuring this thing out based on scientific evidence, or some kind of philosophical or understanding evidence based on your experiences with philosophy or whatever it may be, and understanding the reality, how smart you are, how wordy you are, how you can describe things, how articulate you are, and it's almost contriving that stuff just to make sure that you feel like there's something more to this reality. You can describe some fourth dimension where you don't eat, but you do blah, and you do something else. You do something else in a different way. You see colors you haven't seen, but colors aren't colors or something else, but you see them differently. But there's infinite numbers of that. And there's infinite mystery, but isn't the point of having a mystery is to solve the mystery? So what's the point in a mystery if you can't solve it? But once you solve it, there's nothing more to contrive except the truth and trying to live in reality and trying to get day to day through your life and doing nothing more than just going and grinding through the gears of life and doing nothing more than reaching an end based on a beginning that didn't need to happen to begin with. So yeah, it's contriving all sorts of things. That's all we're doing is contriving things. Just because you think of it doesn't mean it's possible, and just because it is possible doesn't mean you couldn't think of some kind of contrivance. And just because you can think of that contrivance based off something that is true doesn't mean it is true. The contrivance is true. It doesn't mean that because you're basing it off something that exists doesn't mean that you're not just contriving something. There's a major disconnect between the reality and the reality that you're living in and the description that you're giving it, because based on our mutual understanding, you're just saying crap. And not only that, you're saying crap in general, because generally speaking, you can, in many cases, you can understand where a person's coming from, but we generalize these experiences. Sort of like when you explain something and you say you understand what someone's saying, even though you don't, or vice versa, someone else says it, and they obviously don't understand exactly the experience. Then you go into detail, it's like, oh, that's what you meant. You go into more detail, it requires more detail, and it's your responsibility to point out that detail and describing the situation as thoroughly as possible so that the right amount of context is given to a situation so everyone understands, at least to a certain mutual point in understanding the certain circumstance. And thinking doesn't mean possible. It's possible that you can think about it, yeah, and it's something that can exist inside a notion inside your head, but the notion is still just a notion. It's not a physical thing that exists beyond an interaction of a notion based on a physical process. It's causing, by proxy, by interaction, causing some kind of ethereal thing called process and thinking inside of your head and understanding these concepts based on words. It doesn't exist in and of itself, and that's a distinction. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a unicorn that exists. There's no such thing as time travel that exists. But time travel is a concept more than anything, a possibility. It's not an actual thing. There's a time machine you can think about, but obviously there's a disconnect between physical things, concepts, and ideas like that, and actual physical things that could exist or don't exist. And so when you're thinking about these things that can't exist, it also depends on if it's a concept or if it's an actual thing that exists, and if it's you can contrive all sorts of things based on physical things that can exist, but obviously it's more about concepts, and things like time travel and things like that are good examples in describing the situation I'm describing, because time travel can't exist other than an idea or a concept that can't exist in and of itself, and it's not a physical object that can be represented in this reality other than a process that's happening, sort of like the process of you thinking about something. It's a process, and it's nothing more than a process of you thinking. It can exist as a thought, but nothing more. And just because you can think it doesn't mean it's possible. Just because you can think of a contrivance based off of that possibility, a real possibility, doesn't mean that anything. You've made something up at the contrivance as opposed to making something up at the false premise that you've created based on something that doesn't exist to begin with, or something that's not possible at all to begin with. It's just a theory, and you could theorize things, but theories aren't real. Sort of like something doesn't exist in and of itself, right? Something doesn't exist. It's a thought in your head, a notion that is disconnected from the reality you're living in. The reality that you're living in deems it unable so. So you can live out a fantasy in your head, but you obviously have to run into all these brick walls. But sometimes you just decide to turn all those brick walls off and just go with it, and just decide to say screw with the logic and just say go with it, because obviously the contrivances you can sort of just overturn. And obviously the reality creates the existence, and reality you can't ignore it, because reality creates the circumstances that are possible, while your mind, your contrivances, your notions create the circumstances that are possible. And you could go anywhere in your mind as opposed to reality, because reality would just self-describe the situations that you're living in and describing to begin with. So that describes the situations, why our mind can contrive it, and it doesn't need to make sense or be real. We can just go off in left field and completely make things up, while reality would be self-describing the situations that are possible, and our mind can self-describe the situations that aren't possible. It's just a notion in our head, and the notion in our head is real, and it's possible, but it's nothing beyond that, and that's a distinction. It's nothing more than a notion. It doesn't exist in and of itself outside of the notion in my head. It's not a physical thing outside of my head. It's not anything beyond a physical interaction, sort of like it's just a physical interaction leading to another physical interaction that we call this ethereal thing called thinking, a lot like another thing that's real, or something that's ethereal, like a process like, say, time travel. That's not possible. It's sort of that disconnection between something that's actually a physical object, sort of like a physical thing that's causing the thinking, the process, and the thinking itself, the thing that is caused by these physical processes, sort of like something out there, like a time machine that you can apply to some kind of vague concept, apply some kind of contrivance to. And just because you think it doesn't mean it's possible. And I'm sorry for this video going on long enough. I don't know if I thoroughly described this good enough, but I tried my best, and I might go on this subject again. So thank you, and until next time, bye.